Hey everyone, welcome back to Armed and Fabulous with Lauren Liberty, where we discuss Second Amendment rights from the female perspective. Today I have the pleasure of having our attorney, Brittany Huttner, on the show. Welcome, Brittany.
Thank you, Lauren Liberty.
Thanks so much for being here today. I've been so excited for this.
Me as well. We have a good topic today.
I think so, too. So why don't you start out by telling us a little bit about yourself and how you ended up at the Attorneys for Freedom law firm?
Yeah, for sure. So I am a criminal defense attorney here at the firm. I am somewhat new to Arizona. I grew up in Illinois, went to law school in Chicago, so I've kind of a different perspective of gun laws and stuff like that because of that. When me and my fiance moved to Arizona, I knew that I wanted to do criminal defense, wasn't ever a question. And I wanted to go to, like Mark says, a real criminal defense firm, right? And that's how I landed here. Saw what the firm was about, saw the pro-freedom movement that Mark wants to establish, how strong he is about your Second Amendment rights and stuff like that. And that really resonated with me, especially coming from a place where a different state, they view Second Amendment laws differently, and it's definitely a different climate than where I came from, so it just kind of, it resonated with me more.
It's treated more as a privilege rather than a right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's a great way to put it.
I definitely feel that, as I've mentioned in the past, being from New York myself. Yeah, it's hard to imagine staying in a place like that where you can't protect yourself.
It's an epidemic because of all of the crime and all of the just you always feeling vulnerable. Mm-hmm. There was never a time that I felt safe. I lived downtown, commuted, public transportation to law school, right? And I knew that I was always a target, right? It's hard to even kind of put into perspective how on edge I felt until I was removed from it, until I moved somewhere where I felt like I could protect myself, and even in a safer neighborhood, completely changed my life. And I didn't realize how fight or flight I constantly was until I was out of that. And I was like, oh, wow, I can walk down the street and feel okay.
You can relax a little bit.
Pretty cool, And so, yeah, definitely it's different lifestyle.
So when you were living back home in Illinois, did you have any sort of experience with firearms or anything like that?
So yes, but not like some other people. So definitely had family experience where my grandma and grandpa are super into firearms, and I would go over there and shoot and stuff like that. And that was my only experience with it. Other than that, Illinois gun laws are so crazy that you need a FOID card, you need a concealed carry, and I always felt too nervous against the things that I had to do to even be legal with a firearm that I never wanted to even think about carrying because of that. There's a lot of prohibited places in Chicago where you can't go with a firearm, and I was like, what if I just walk into a place? What if I need to go to the bathroom? I don't want to subject myself to that. So I never carried or anything like that. It was more just shooting practice, stuff like that out in the suburbs with my grandparents. So that was really the only time that I ever got to even shoot guns. Well, that I felt comfortable with because, like I said, they're so strict there that I did not want to mess with it.
And isn't that so sad that they make you jump through so many hoops to be able to exercise this right to protect yourself?
Absolutely. And with the FOID card, right? So you can get a FOID card, but that doesn't mean that you can carry, right? That means that it can be broken apart, right, or disassembled like in your house, right? But you can't travel with it. So you have to disassemble it to travel, then travel to the shooting range. And there's so many things that you can mess up along the way that I'm like, I'm trying to take the bar. I got to go through character and fitness. Like I can't catch a charge like that, right? And so it just dissuaded me from ever wanting to try to attempt to do this because I was so nervous that I would forget one thing, right? And I see that even with some clients, right, in different states, is that you think you're doing everything right, and then you forget one thing, and then they come at you, right? It's like, well, you're going after the wrong people here, right? But regardless, that's just how it is.
Yeah, it's almost like they are manufacturing the crimes to happen by law-abiding citizens or people trying to do the right thing.
And they want to make an example out of you, right? And so that's the issue too. And so, there's so many times in Chicago where I felt like I could not have defended myself. And part of that you could say was my choice, right? Because I didn't want to go through those hoops to get it, but I was just so scared that I would forget one thing and it would blow up in my face, right? I didn't want to take that chance, but yeah, it's crazy.
It is. I had a very, very similar experience myself living in New York, and that was the main catalyst of why I chose to leave. I saw that I could not protect myself, and I think many people realize that. And it's sad because, I miss my family, but who knows if I would still be alive to even be able to miss my family if I got into some sort of altercation there and, something
Absolutely.
bad happened.
And I think it's different once you see crime in your face, right? When you look crime, or when you look a perpetrator in the face, right, is different. And it really stays with you. And so I had one example is that when I was downtown, I saw crime every day, right? It was absolutely insane. But one of the things that I'll never forget, I was on the train to go to school, right, with my backpack, right? Public transportation, kind of very dangerous in Chicago. The L, if anybody, is from Chicago, you know what I'm talking about. Blue line, red line, it's, really dangerous, but that's how I got to school, right? And there was a robbery right across from me. This poor woman, gun in her face, demanding everything, and she's just freaking out. And I was like, just don't look, right? I don't have anything to protect myself or her, right? In this situation, hopefully he doesn't see me.
Right.
Hopefully I just become invisible. And that was I have goosebumps just even talking about it. I mean, it was crazy, right? She was looking down the barrel of a gun and nobody around, right? Because you can't carry, and you can't do that. And so she couldn't protect herself, right? Or I couldn't protect her because I didn't go through the hoops that the city of Chicago required. I should say the state of Illinois required at the time. So she was, luckily nobody was harmed, mentally and emotionally, but not physically. And he got away, and who knows, he probably did that a million other times. But yeah, it was really scary to be this close and be like, I can't protect you, I can't protect myself. It kind of changed the way that I looked at self-defense, right? And it's just, it's scary.
Yeah, it really is. And it's like fish in a barrel. Very rarely is a criminal going to abide by a law and say, right, oh, this is a gun-free zone. Sorry, I can't commit any crimes here. I'm going to take that somewhere else. You almost have to wonder, are these people targeting these gun-free zones because they know that people are not armed? And it's an easy way to make a living if they want to just continue robbing people. Who's to say all you could do is sit there and pray that you were not the next victim?
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's when you say that, right, it puts it in perspective of, if I'm walking down the street, the person that's robbing me is probably having an illegal weapon. So what are the gun regulations doing? Right? If we talk about the policy of it, is it deterring the law-abiding citizens or the people who are scared to, fall into the trap of not being law-abiding? Or is it the people who have illegal weapons, right? They're going to disregard all the regulations. So like you said, it's kind of, you're tying the hands of the law-abiding citizens.
Yeah, exactly. You're just putting people in a tough spot where they have to decide, do they want to potentially get in trouble for trying to protect themselves or just completely take the risk of not having any self-protection at all because you're worried about catching charges yourself. Yeah,
and I think also experiences change people and their perspective. And so Chicago has always been in the news for, issues that the city has. But I saw firsthand from when I started law school to when I ended law school how different it was, how worse it got, right? And so after that, right, maybe some people didn't feel as strongly about, self-defense and their firearm rights, but I assure you probably now, if you're from Illinois, you probably feel a little bit differently from it, right? Especially after COVID and, the whole city kind of went up in arms per se, right? And so I bet you a lot of people do feel differently than even they did before, right? People grow, stronger opinions once they realize, the issues that it's causing. So
yeah, and actually speaking of COVID, so one interesting statistic is that since 2020, the largest demographic of new gun owners was actually women starting in 2020. So I think a lot of people's minds did change and they saw how at a disadvantage they are if there is a situation that arises.
Absolutely.
So I know you did describe that subway experience, and I know a lot of women that I've talked to have actually had experiences that were real eye-openers for them. Do you have anything that you're comfortable talking about?
Yeah, so there's a couple, but my most prominent one is definitely involving my dog. And anybody who knows me knows that my dog is my life. So if you try and come from him, you're going to have to mess with me, right? So we were walking downtown. Of course, we're in Lincoln Park. If anybody's watching from Chicago, you kind of know where that area is. Super nice area. Very safe, they say. I don't know. I would argue differently. But we're walking, and it's kind of dusk outside. So, always hyper vigilant in this situation. And I notice a woman's following me. So, like any person does, I'm like, okay, I got to see if she's actually following me, right? I don't want to just think that she's following me. Maybe she's going to the same location, right? So I start making circles and going back like I went, across the street, cross again, just doing ridiculous things. And she just continued to follow me. So I call my fiance and I'm like, somebody's following me. I don't know what to do in this situation. I don't have a firearm, right? I don't conceal carry. I don't have the permit. I don't know what to do. I have my knife. That's all I had. And so he's like, get off the phone with me and call 911. And I'm like, okay. So I'm still, walking now. I'm like almost running because I'm like, this is scary, right? Why are you following me? I've crossed the street a million times. I've gone in a circle. I've come back. Like,
it wouldn't make any sense for her to still be following you.
No, it was ridiculous.
Yeah, it wasn't a coincidence.
No.
Yeah.
And, my instincts kicked in. I knew immediately that I was in a dangerous situation. And so call 911 and they're like, you need to run. They first asked me, what kind of dog do you have? Because I was like, I'm walking my dog. Somebody's following me. First question is, what kind of dog do you have? And I said, a husky. And she says, you need to get out of there. You need to go to, try and go in a crowd of people, right? They're probably after your dog. He's a high profile dog and people steal dogs here, right? Like Frenchies, Huskies, all that stuff, because they think that they can either breed him or sell him for money. And so I'm like, what the heck? I'm like, I just rescued him for $20.
You can get your own purebred dog.
It's super easy. Rescue a dog.
Wow.
So I just start like immediately running and I yell. I'm like, I'm on 911. I'm calling the police, right? Like trying to make them aware of like that they're going to come after you. And immediately this truck slams on his brakes and she jumps in the truck and starts to follow me. And I'm like, oh my God, they were totally, I don't know if it was kidnap situation, a dog. I don't know. I can only speculate at this point, but the officers did find the truck and nobody was in there. I don't know if they just, kind of left it there and ran. I don't know. But they were definitely following us. And yeah, they said it was because of our dog. And I was so close to that truck that I'm like, if I was just a little bit slower, I don't know what would have happened. And again, this is downtown Chicago. There's a lot of people, right? A lot of people around me. And it just didn't matter, right? That still was happening with all of these people around me. And it's like, people say like, oh, stay in public or go to a public space. And she's like, go to a safe place. I'm like, where do I go? I'm on the streets. Right. And then I didn't want to go home, right? Because I didn't know if they were still following me. Didn't want to walk into my apartment complex because I lived right there at the time. And so then there was a coincidence, I think 2 days later, a woman comes up to me, is like petting Balto, asking me all these questions, like if he's neutered and all these questions. And I'm like, are you guys watching me? Right? Like, and it was like, again, I'm sure that was just a coincidence. I'm sure she was just a nicer old lady, but that sticks with you. And then you're just like on edge all the time, right?
That's a very weird question to ask a pet owner. So
I know.
I don't blame you for being suspicious at all.
And it's like, I don't know. And that was blocks away from my house. And so at that point, I'm like looking over my shoulder to make sure nobody saw where I lived.
Right.
And I lived alone. And it's just, you never know. And it's like, it's scary. It's scary. So
it's very scary. And I also find it kind of alarming that the suggestion was to run away.
Yes,
right? Because what if you can't run away?
Yes, absolutely.
Not everybody has the physical ability to be able to run away, or even just the knowledge of where to go or what,
And the fight or flight kicks in, and it's like I'm on the phone with the police, and they tell me to, run away, find a safe place. I'm like, where's a safe place, right? Like, where do I go, right? I mean, where do I go? So I just immediately started running towards like the business, business street, I will call it, right? But
like a district type of thing.
And so I was like, okay, I'm just gonna run into a store, right? But I don't know what they're capable of.
Right.
And so it was just crazy. And then to also hear the police say like, we'll just run away, right? And so
sorry about it, just run away, good luck. And you never know how many other people are involved in this thing. I've never heard the story before. This is my first time hearing it. And I did not expect you to say that she jumped into a truck.
Yeah,
so she had at least one accomplice.
At least. And it's like, I'm only one person.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not a superhero here, right? And so like another one, I'll tell you one more story.
Sure.
But another story was that it was right before we moved. We're actually loading the pod to ship the pod to Arizona. So we're back and forth between my apartment and the suburbs because that's where the pod was at our parents' house. And so we were coming back and we're on Lakeshore Drive. Again, if you've been in Chicago, like the famous Lakeshore Drive. Beautiful scenery, and all of a sudden that was miles from my house, right? We should have been home in about 15 minutes, and the GPS was like an hour and a half, 2 hours, 2.5 hours, 3 hours. And I'm like, what is going on Lakeshore Drive? Like, was there a crash? What's going on, right? So again, me and my fiance are in my car, and I guess it was Mexican Independence Day parade. Or I should say Mexican Independence Day.
Okay.
And then I guess there was something on social media that prompted everybody to come to Lakeshore Drive and like have a party in the street. So thousands of people are parked now on Lakeshore Drive. You can't go through it all. People have, blown off fireworks, and, it seemed to be like a happy festival right at one point. Obviously illegal, right? Because you can't just stop the road because you want to, celebrate. But anyways.
Yeah, you can't just have an impromptu block party. You gotta arrange these things.
Yeah, you gotta shut down the street and stuff. But so we were fine. We're just hanging out. We're like, hopefully we'll get around soon, right? Bad traffic because of this. And all of a sudden we started getting threats, right? Screaming at us. And I was in a little Honda Civic, right? So tiny car, fishbowl, as my fiance calls it, not tinted windows.
Yeah.
We start getting threats, and they're like, yelling profanities at us. And we're like, the heck do we do? Like, what do we do? And so they're yelling us to get out of the car and all of this stuff. And they're drinking. It just got out of control, right? There was probably a couple bad apples around us that probably ruined it for everybody, but it was absolutely insane. So now I called the police again, and I'm like, what do I do in this situation? I said, I'm being threatened. Can you please send police to, make sure that this is handled, right? I don't want this to get out of control. We're just trying to get home. We can't get home. And the police said, oh, well, it's 1,000 to 1. We were told to stand down, and we're not coming. And I was like, what do you mean you're not coming? What do you mean you're not coming? That's your job, serve and protect. What do you mean you're not coming? They're like, yes, we've had, a lot of calls about this, but we're not equipped to handle this situation. And I was like, you have horses, you have military grade equipment.
Right.
What do you mean you're not equipped to handle it? Like, what do you mean by that? It doesn't make any sense. Yeah, we had to figure it out by ourselves. It took hours to get home, and they told us, just don't come. We advise you, this is probably going to happen all weekend. We just advise you not to come downtown tomorrow. And I was like, I live here. Like,
oh my goodness.
What am I supposed to do? And so it was another situation of us being threatened. And so Dan was like, unbuckle. We might have to run. We'll leave the car. Unbuckle right now. We're going to have to run. And I was like, run where? Like,
right.
I'm not fast.
And but in a crowd of thousands of people,
it was
where are you
the only
go?
situation. Being threatened in our cars. We're sitting in our car looking around like, what did we walk into here? Like, we're just driving home. Insane. Again, police don't want to help you sometimes, right? You have to make sure that you can help yourself because somebody might not come and save you.
Yes. Yes. And that's an issue that I talk about pretty often is how you have to be your own first responder. Some of these departments are underfunded, understaffed, overwhelmed. Regardless of the reason, they're not able to respond. So you have to be able to protect yourself, your family, your dog. Like that's something that I would never even think of. And I have a purebred dog myself. The only thing I've ever felt the need to have to protect him from was a coyote that he thought was another puppy, and he was like wagging his tail.
He's like, wow, this is so nice.
And the coyote jumped over the fence, and thankfully I did have a tool of self-defense on me at that point, but I would never think another person would steal a dog. That is so crazy.
Yeah. It also happened to Lady Gaga, so you gotta be careful.
Oh, yes, her French bulldogs.
Yeah.
I remember that. It's getting tough out there, guys.
Watch your dogs.
Stay strapped or get clapped.
Honestly, if you don't want to stay strapped for yourself, stay strapped for your dog.
For your puppies. Save the puppies. Also, you can save the puppies by abolishing the ATF.
Yeah, is that what they're saying now?
Yes.
Oh, let's talk about the ATF.
Oh, I could talk about the ATF for a very long time. Something that made me kind of happy recently was to hear that the ATF's budget was slashed by 7%, which I would argue that the ATF's budget should be cut by 100% and brought down to 0 so that we can abolish the ATF. But that's a conversation for another day. But I know that you and I actually have had a couple of interesting conversations about recent news regarding the ATF's ruling on bump stocks, because that's going through the Supreme Court right now. And I know that you're pretty familiar with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think it's interesting too, because, there's always a statutory argument and then a policy argument, right? And so I think they're two different things, right? And they should be two different things. And so it's interesting to see even what was focused on with the oral arguments, to see how the justices are going to rule on this. And so if it does fall under, does a bump stock on a semi-automatic weapon qualify as machine gun? Or do the justices, think that it should qualify as that because of a policy argument? And so I think that's the interesting thing when you look at the definition. Should it fall under the machine gun definition? I would argue, and I believe you would argue as well, no, it should not. But, the justices threw in some policy arguments of, I understand why these should be banned and stuff. And that is kind of concerning, only because I believe that it should be ruled on what the statute says, right? How to qualify this under the current statute. And it's kind of frustrating to see that maybe they'll forego the statute or make it fit, right? The bump stock. And that's, kind of frustrating.
Yes, that is what was particularly concerning to me about this whole thing. So this bump stock ban goes back to the Trump era, right? This happened shortly after the Las Vegas mass shooting in 2017. And then in 2018, the ATF issued this ruling, right? And it was really shady the way the ATF did this. I don't know of any other word how to describe it, but they circumvented going through Congress, and they went and they sort of retroactively or amended these definitions to change it to mean what they want it to mean now.
And they also, I think the most important part is that they qualified bump stocks as allowable, right? I mean, what
Previously.
other word? Yes. And so they always said that it didn't qualify under this definition up until one act. And I think that's really important to note too, is they kind of flip-flop. They 180'd their own statements for years and years about this particular issue, right? And so how do you just change your opinion to mean the opposite, the complete opposite than what you were saying before?
Yeah, they said, well, according to the definition, bump stocks aren't classified as machine guns. And then they went and changed the definition, and they were like, oh, look at that. They're machine
It
guns
fits
now. Wow.
It fits.
It's very interesting. And I think you make a good point how there was one incident involving this. And now we are making changes at the federal level. We are not even going through Congress. There's not even new legislation being created, right? They didn't even try that. They were like, we'll just change some things around and make the pieces fit. And I was reading that there was an estimated 520,000 people that had purchased bump stocks. Bump stocks first came about in like the early 2000s. So during that time that they were not considered to be illegal, over 500,000 people owned these. And there was one incident, and now they're completely illegal. And the other thing that really bothered me about that ruling is that the people that owned the bump stocks were not notified. So I know you're probably familiar with the FRTs and the Watts. People were getting letters from the ATF saying these are illegal now. You're a criminal because we decided that that's how things were going to be. And now you have to either destroy this or turn it over to the ATF, right? I mean, we saw a lot of those cases
Absolutely. And so it comes an issue of all of a sudden you can be charged with a serious felony, right? And so what do you do in that situation? And I know some clients, even with FRT triggers, are scared to even turn it in, right? Because they're like, well, I've had this for a little bit, right? I mean, the laws changed, and now I didn't turn it in the day that, I got the letter, life got busy. Can they come after me because I haven't turned it in yet? I'm so nervous, right? There's a lot of stress that comes around that because, again, law-abiding citizens do things the right way. They don't ever want to be in a predicament where they can be charged with a felony. So a lot of these, I would say a lot of the people don't even know that they could be in possession of something that's illegal if they're not following the daily news.
They're not reading the Federal Register, right?
You don't do that?
I actually do, because I guess I'm a nerd. But I don't think your average person, I don't know, maybe I'm underestimating average people. I apologize if that's true. But I don't think that people check this frequently enough. Even if you do check it once in a while, I don't think they're checking it daily to see what decisions are made, right? And that's unfair because, again, manufacturing criminals out of people who are law-abiding citizens, they did nothing wrong. They literally purchased a part for their completely legal firearm, and now because of some ruling, they're considered a criminal.
Absolutely. And so I think it's important to kind of look at the definition too and actually bring it back to the basics, right? Of actual, how does this work? How does a bump stock work, right? How does it work in relation to a machine gun, and how does that work, right? And I think focusing on that definition is very important. And I think the other important thing is policy, right? So there's one bad egg, right, that uses it in a, how should I say that?
For a nefarious reason.
Yeah. And one person out of, you said 550,000, use this bump stock, and then it is changed forever. And so we think about that as a policy matter, right? We talk about policy all the time in law, especially with legislation, of one person, right, uses it one way and it's banned forever. Now, if you look at cars, people drive drunk, people use it all the time in a way that they shouldn't, right? And we've never seen that dramatic of a change in law. And so I think it's interesting when we think about that as well, that one person, used it inappropriately and this huge ban came out.
So to your point about how other things can be used and can kill people, similarly with a bump stock, right? You don't need a bump stock to be able to bump fire a weapon. You can actually use your belt loop. Yes. Yes.
I didn't know that. News to me.
You can use your belt loop to actually bump fire. You can use a rubber band to bump fire. So where is the ATF's ruling on belt loops? Be careful, people. You won't be able to wear belts anymore. Suspenders from here on out.
They're coming for your belts.
They're coming for your rubber bands. So that's the craziest thing. Really, why does this standard apply to one thing and not other things that can have the same effect? And I do think that it is important to get into the definitions of things, because in the original NFA Act of 1934, which is, 90 years ago at this point, they specified that a machine gun is a single action of the trigger, right?
The exact wording is by a single function of the trigger. I have it right here.
That's what I meant. Single function of the trigger. And that is important because the way that a trigger functions, if you've never fired a fully automatic weapon, there is one single function of the trigger. You pull the trigger once and you hold it and the magazine unloads, and it's really fun, by the way. So that's important because that is the definition as it's written in the NFA, right? So to all of a sudden change this, so when you're bump firing, the trigger on a semi-automatic, there's a trigger reset, right? So you pull the trigger back, and then about halfway upon releasing the trigger, there's a trigger reset. And to me, that is a completely separate function, right? You pull the trigger, it resets, you pull it again. That is two separate functions of the trigger. That is not one. So I think that the ATF, if I'm not mistaken, I believe they successfully changed it to say one pull of the trigger. So now you're actually pulling the trigger only once and then it resets. So they are definitely tailor-fitting this to suit their needs in order to circumvent going through Congress.
Absolutely. And so I think it's interesting because a lot of the oral arguments that happened, recently, I should say, one of the main arguments in the oral arguments in front of the Supreme Court was actually the science behind the trigger and if it is a single pull of the trigger, if it's a single function of the trigger. And they spent a lot of time on that. And I think that's really important because that's what the court should be looking at, right? Policy, Congress, right? If Congress believes there should be a new policy in place, then Congress should pass legislation. And so I think it's really important for the Supreme Court to look at the definition and see if that fits bump stock, right? Or bump stocks. I don't believe that they should look at policy, only because that's not the function of this case, right? The case is, does the definition fit bump stocks, right? And I don't think policy has a place here. Now, of course, policy always has a place in the Supreme Court. I understand that. But I think the most important thing is to, like you said, who came up with this definition and how the ATF changed the definition. I think that's important in this case, right?
Yeah, I completely agree. And it was really frustrating reading the arguments and seeing Justice Brown just undermine all of the arguments made about the specific language and say, to paraphrase here, but why do the definitions even matter? Well, they do matter because that's why we have definitions of things, because that's how they are described. And when you're creating legislation, you need to have correct definitions. So I think that it is a big deal, and I think that it does matter. And I think that's a very important argument to make. I just found it very disappointing to see that argument made.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think another argument, I don't remember which justice explained this, but one of the justices sitting on the bench questioned why, if this did fall under the definition, why the Bush administration hasn't done this, why the Obama administration hasn't done this, right? Because this was legal before. And so it's, I think that's important too, is that this was legal under this definition for so long until one act happened, right? One unfortunate circumstance happened. And I think that's what's interesting, because like you said, they're trying to puzzle piece this to make it fit. And if Congress feels that, new policy is required, then they can take those steps, right? But this is not the step to do it.
I agree. And having been to some of these congressional offices and talked with their Second Amendment or gun safety portfolios, like they have staff that have you been to Washington, D.C.?
I have not.
Okay, it's really fun. We met with a bunch of offices. We actually met with all anti-gun offices, all offices that just were not really even interested in talking to us. Some of them were okay, but some of them, you could tell it was going in one ear and out the other. And it was really scary talking to them and seeing the lack of understanding of what they're trying to even legislate. So that itself is really scary, and that's why it's so important to talk with your legislators. Educate, don't legislate, right? Because that's how you put law-abiding people in danger of catching charges and becoming criminals themselves. So it's actually... I know this is supposed to go through Congress, but meeting with congressional offices, that also scares me. At least it's the proper way to do it.
Yeah.
But
that's fair.
that really
fair.
Scares me. We have a lot of work to do, people. We really do. So it's good to know that at least we are on the same page there and we have the same understanding. It's too bad that the other Supreme Court justices can't get on the same page as us. So one thing that I wanted to ask was, have you had a lot of cases where you've dealt with something involving firearms?
Yeah, definitely a lot of cases involving firearms. Anything from criminal convictions, actually, or a criminal charge, and also gun right restoration. Okay. And so that's something that I am very passionate about, that I didn't know much of before I started working here. And so that's something that I love to do for clients. And so the procedure of getting your gun rights back is very, very long, only because the court can take a long time to rule on these motions. And the other reason is because our Department of Public Safety is often bad at fixing their records or updating the records once you get it set aside. And so something that I feel very passionate about, because I've seen so many people get their rights taken away, and then they were like, you know what, I want to go hunting with my son, right, for the first time. I want to buy my son his first hunting rifle, and these traditional things that people often like to do with their families, or, even just for protection, right? And so being able to give somebody the tools to get that firearm back or that firearm rights back is so powerful. And so one of my favorite things to do is motion to set asides and restoration of firearm rights. And so the issue, though, that a lot of people have is that they do get these set asides and their DPS record is not updated, which they can still then not be able to purchase a firearm. Our public or our state system isn't the best at updating those without us requiring it. I know, it's kind of crazy. Like, they want to keep these people's gun rights taken, right? So the court gives it back to you, and you still have to check your DPS record to make sure that's reflected. And I will say most of the time now, I just require my client, or I shouldn't say require, I advise my clients to still do a DPS fingerprint report after the set aside. And 9 times out of 10, we have to demand them to fix their records because they haven't ever fixed their records. Now that means DPS also hasn't sent it to the FBI and NICS to also fix their records. So even though the court gave you back your firearm rights, it still hasn't been reflected. So if you're pulled over, right, or they see your DPS record, they can actually think that you are a prohibited possessor when you're really not anymore. So it's really important, once you do get your gun rights restored, to make sure your DPS record is reflected of that. And I will say it's also really hard because DPS has so many procedures that you have to follow, and one of them being you only have 35 days to demand them to fix or put them on notice that their record is wrong, or else you have to start the process over again. So, and that's a lot of people don't also realize that, because how are you supposed to know, right? It's in little print on the DPS form. So a lot of procedures. And so a lot of people can do this by themselves, but it's also really hard because you don't know the ins and outs, and you don't understand, or I shouldn't say, you're not aware that DPS is also really bad at fixing their records.
it's coming full circle, right? Because it's another instance of so many hoops to jump through to just get that right to protect yourself.
Absolutely. Especially when you've been law-abiding for so long and you still can't get your firearm rights back, right? And so usually what you have to do is you have to wait until probation is over, and then after probation, you have to wait some time to show that you've changed your life around, that you're law-abiding, stuff like that. But it's long. It's a long process, especially because the court has, the prosecutor has, or I should say the state has an opportunity to respond to your motion, and the court has to rule on it. And it's not at the court's, most important part of the docket, and so you're kind of pushed to the side for a little bit. So it is hard because, like you said, right, there's a lot of reasons why somebody wants a firearm, and just waiting around for a court to rule that you can have it again is sometimes frustrating.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank goodness for wonderful attorneys such as yourself.
Saving the world.
Yeah, one gun rights restoration at a time. Thank you so much for joining me today on the show. I really had a great time talking with you.
Of course. Thank you for inviting me. I had a blast.
Yeah, I'd love to have you on again sometime.
I hope so too.
Thanks so much for tuning in today to Armed and Fabulous with Lauren Liberty. If you liked today's video, make sure to like, subscribe, and click on the bell for notifications. For more legal advice, check out Attorneys for Freedom at attorneysforfreedom.com, and also look into our Attorneys on Retainer program at attorneysonretainer.us. If there's any topics that you want us to discuss on the show, be sure to leave a comment below. Till next time, stay armed and stay fabulous.